Good evening, everyone. My name is Tara Johnson-Noem. I'm a member of the Behringer-Crawford Museum's Board of Trustees, and I am so pleased to have you all with us tonight for an excellent program, I think, very interesting, about the Bavarian Brewery. We are going to get started after just a couple of introductory remarks. First of all, many of you have now been joining us for almost 2 months now. So for those of you that have been with us all the time, thank you and welcome again. For those of you that are new, this is a program designed to provide access to Northern Kentucky's rich history across Boone, Kenton, and Campbell counties. It's Zoom-based. Many of us are quite familiar with Zoom at this point, but for those that may be a little bit more new to the platform, I have muted everyone just so we don't get interrupted by maybe a stray dog bark or a child or something. If you would like to participate and interact with us, and we hope you do, please enter your comments or questions into the chat box. That'll be your best way to communicate during the course of the event. I will be monitoring the chat, either replying in real time if there's something specific that's urgent, or for questions, I'll be compiling all of those and then asking those at the end of the event. So indicate any of your questions and comments in the chat. If you want to keep your video running, that's just fine, but just let you know if you want to turn it off, that's just fine too. And let's see, I want to also, of course, thank the supporters of Behringer-Crawford Museum. We're supported by many donors and members. If you're not a member yet, we would encourage you to join us. You can go to bcmuseum.org to join and be a member today. We're also supported by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Carol, Ann, and Ralph V. Hale U.S. Bank Foundation, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and we are so thankful for their continued support. We have a great program today because we actually have two guests. We have a return appearance by our very own Curator of Collections, Jason French. Jason, thanks so much for coming back. Jason
Always a pleasure.
has been our curator for many years now, but before that, he came to us from the Cincinnati Museum Center, where he has a strong background in really bringing history to life for people in many different forms. And you know what, Jason, I would be remiss if I did not also mention that we are strongly supported by ArtsWave. So I'm sorry about that. I did want to get that in. We are also joined today by a new special guest, Ried Schott. Mr. Schott is president of Schott Consulting Services. He has a rich background in commercial real estate and has had several executive positions, managing rental properties, being an angel investor, and has invested in over a dozen startup companies in the past decade. He is a trustee of AOF Pacific, a nonprofit housing company with more than 15,000 units. He's been a real estate appraiser, a market analyst, a review appraiser, a real estate broker, a commercial lender. You get the idea. He has a very strong background in real estate. He has, he presently lives in California, but he is originally from our area. His education includes studies in liberal arts, business, and graduate studies from, degrees from UCLA and NYU. Early in his career, he completed various courses from appraisal organizations and continues to practice real estate in Florida and California. So Mr. Schott is joining us because he has a rich family background in the Bavarian Brewery, and I think you're going to really enjoy the story and the slides that he has prepared. We're going to start with Jason, and Jason is going to provide this week's quiz question. For those of you that have been with us for a while, you know every week we do a quiz. So Jason's going to give you some background about some of the families, an overall background about the brewing history of Northern Kentucky, and then we're going to turn it over to Mr. Schott, and he is going to talk about his own family and Bavarian. So I hope you enjoy it. And Jason, hats off to you.
All right. Well, we'll start. I guess we can start with the quiz question first, and then I'll just delve briefly into German immigration and brewing history just very quickly. So we'd like having a quiz question. I have an artifact here I'm going to show you. It is related to brewing in northern Kentucky. It has a slight tie or a tie to Bavarian. However, it is not Bavarian. So the question is, when I show this to you, can you identify what it is? And we'll take the questions and try to see if somebody guesses it by the end of the presentation. So just a moment here. What I have is, can everybody see this beautiful item here? So this is the item. Try to give you a full view. And from there.
And Jason, just a reminder, if someone would like to try to guess what that item is, they could win a Northern Kentucky History Hour pin, and they should indicate their answer in the chat box, please.
That is correct. I always forget that. So, I won't, the real prize is listening to Ried tonight. So I just want to kind of remind people, those of you who are not aware of really how brewing became such a big part of our regional history, it really gets its start with some revolutions that were happening amongst the German states in Europe, because Germany wasn't a unified country in the early part of the 19th century, and it wasn't really until the 1870s that it starts really in unification with a guy named Otto von Bismarck. So what happened is around 1848, there were a lot of little revolutions with a lot of people in the German states areas that were really trying to change and unify the German-speaking people under a fair and just government. Well, and that kind of failed. There were failed revolutions. And many of the participants in those revolutions decided that it was probably a good idea to get out of town. They either were wanted or they just were discouraged. So many of those Germans moved elsewhere around the world, and the United States received a lot of German immigrants from those failed revolutions, and we call them 48ers. And those 48ers came with very much kind of a German mindset, and they started, really building communities in our region. The Cincinnati area was one of the largest areas, and Northern Kentucky is certainly part of that, one of the largest cities in the entire United States at the time. And it was definitely the largest inland community that's kind of a metropolitan community. So with these German immigrants coming here, they brought many of their trades, and right in the early 19th century, lagered beer really becomes very common in the German states. And lagering is kind of developed to the point where it becomes its own thing. Prior to that, especially amongst, Anglo-Europeans and things, beer was always an ale as opposed to lagered beers that are cooled in like cave systems or tunnels. So that was brought to the United States at roughly in the same time as those 48ers. So when we look at the history of brewing in our region, and then we also look at the history of a company like Bavarian Brewery, and you see the early roots of Bavarian really in the 1860s coming to play, that's much of those same people. So lagering is pretty new technology at the time. and it doesn't take very long in the United States for it to grow. So the history of Bavarian is tied to even some of those revolutions. And I think Ried can speak to that more with some of the genealogy and the family history of the families that were running Bavarian. So I just kind of wanted to cover that as we think about and give context to this family that comes to the United States and really takes Bavarian to a whole nother level. So I just wanted to kind of mention that, and then we can turn it over to Ried, and he can share all the wonderful knowledge that he has.
I appreciate it, Jason. You provided a nice introduction, and Tara and Laurie and other people that are online that are involved with the museum. I want to appreciate you giving me an opportunity to talk tonight. So, and at the end, if anyone has any questions, either for Jason, myself, or Tara, we'll be glad to entertain those. I have not shared a screen before, and I am in the process of trying to do that. So hopefully we can make this transition. We were able to be successful on it in the past, and here it is. Does it look like this is coming through, Jason?
Yes, it's coming through. So you just, we can see it, go full screen, and we should be good.
Okay. Starting off, I think anytime, one of the things in finding out more about my family, I think maybe like a lot of you, that, unless you have someone in your family that's into genealogy or that's kept good records of your family, sometimes you really don't know that much about your past history. And in order to find out about it, it can be challenging, really challenging. There's been really off and on a few years that, I've been trying to research my ancestry. My uncle, who was actually president of the brewery at one time, William Riedlin Sr, in the 1980s, spent a great deal of time really contacting our relatives and finding out more about our ancestors. And so that helped me a great deal. And actually, he provided all the information that he had researched. So I have that as a source. Besides that, I had a cousin that collected a lot of actually kind of hand-me-downs from his father, a lot of photographs. Actually, we've donated those photographs to the Behringer-Crawford Museum, and they include over about 150 photos, some dating from as early as around the 1880s. And it really, I've been kind of amazed at the type of information that really was left. And some of these photographs too, it's been interesting to me that I didn't even realize that they existed until relatively recently. And this process of trying to understand these photos and analyze them, it's taken a considerable time. But it's like kind of a puzzle. You kind of get some pictures and it's like, when was this taken? Or maybe you have a date, and where was this? And trying to put these pieces together. Anyone that's done their own genealogy, I think they can understand kind of what the process is. And those that haven't and might be interested in going into genealogy, I think maybe part of this presentation, maybe it might inspire you to look into your own genealogy more, and also provide you with some background as far as different sources that you can contact. One, of course, a major one, if you can see my little arrow here, is Ancestry.com. Also, I found like newspapers, if you go into newspapers.com, it was really a wealth of information in some aspects with my ancestors, but especially the brewery. And then also there's been a couple books, done some research, and then there's been some other just sources of information, some supplied through the Behringer-Crawford Museum. So I want to appreciate and acknowledge that. When you start looking at your background, like Jason was talking about, and particularly if your ancestors were German, Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire. I think started maybe with Charlemagne, and beginning, I think, with, it's a complex history, not to go into it in very much detail, but this particular map that you're seeing is what Germany looked like after the Franco-Prussian War. What's interesting is that there were so many provinces and duchies, and there were some sovereign states. Baden, where my ancestors were from, is down in where this little red star is. And I thought it was interesting that when my ancestor, William Riedlin, came from Baden, it was actually at the very beginning, right before the Franco-Prussian War. And I think this is not uncommon for a lot of different countries, people that immigrated to the U.S. There were a lot of wars around the world, and a lot of those people didn't want the strife and maybe didn't want to fight for a cause that they weren't really willing to believe in. And so anyway, that might have been one of the reasons that really my William Riedlin really immigrated to the United States. And the Franco-Prussian War, if you can see here, Alsace-Lorraine, when it started, the war started in 1870. Apparently, it was along this front right here near Palatine. And also, this is Lorraine over here, and Alsace was over here. But you can see that he lived very close to where the Franco-Prussian War started. And so when you're looking into your family history, knowing the history behind and the time frame can give you some insight and maybe what motivated your ancestors to immigrate. This next page got from Ancestry.com, and what it is, it's a passenger list. And so we were able to find actually the ship that my great-grandfather came over on. This is the ship here. It was the SS Baltimore, named after, of course, the city Baltimore. And you can see the passenger log, and in this little area right here, lines 22, they're blown up here. But this is actually the name of my ancestor, William Riedlin. It shows where he was from, Bogesheim in Germany. And then underneath it, it's a little hard, but I believe this is his brother, August, because he was about a year younger, and you can see the ages, 20 and 19. So this is how you can research some of the information about how your ancestors came over to this country. This next page is how they actually, once they came over on a boat, how did they get into the Cincinnati area? So actually there was a Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and you can see these dark lines here that are the main routes for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. These dark lines here are kind of blown up. The section right in here is blown up in here, and you can see Baltimore's here, and it was a fairly direct route. Cincinnati area is right here. So you can see how it's a pretty direct route to get to Cincinnati. So after, immigrants came off the boat, they could hop on the train, and in a few days they could be in their destination. What motivated my ancestor, Riedlin, to come to Cincinnati is because he had his mother that actually moved to Cincinnati a few years before. And so that's the reason he was drawn to Cincinnati. He started working in the Over the Rhine area, which is where his mom lived. And he started working as a blacksmith. He did that for a couple of years. And then he actually worked for a safe company, McNeil and Urban Safe Company. But at one time, I think he had 600 employees. They would make 50 safes a day. It was a major safe company back in the 1870s. During his work there, he made a hammer. His hammer was actually, it's now in the Behringer-Crawford Museum. You can see his initials, WR, and the date that he made the hammer when he was working at the safe company. So finding some of these kind of little puzzles and little kind of indications of your family history, it's, hopefully you have some of those that you've stumbled across too, and it's interesting to analyze those and to share these. My great-grandfather got married in 1877. He married a lady that also lived in the Over the Rhine area, and her name was Matilda Hoffman. She was from actually the other side of Germany, going back a little bit. She was actually from this area up in here near Mecklenburg. And so what's interesting, sometimes you think of like Germans all maybe being from the same area, but Germany had a lot of different dialects. And what's interesting is that probably some of these Germans, even though they were from the same kind of, area, but the specific province that they were from had maybe a very different dialect. They may have not been able to understand one another very well. So here, my great-grandfather is up down here, and he married a lady from way up here. And then on the Schott side of the family, we actually came from this part of Bavaria. So our family, like a lot of families, different parts of Germany is where we really came from. Where they lived in the over the Rhine area. Here we have the 1880 census, and part of this 80 census you can see blown up here at the bottom. It actually identifies a very young William Riedlin family with a daughter, Emma, 1 year old, his wife right here. And the address of the property they were at, up here is kind of hard to see, but it's 467 Vine Street. And they lived in this building here, this 4-story building. And then this bigger building over to the right is actually where he worked. He was a proprietor after he worked for the Safe Company, and then he had a grocery store for about a year. But he saved enough money that he was able to become proprietor of this building here that was called Tivoli Hall. It was a saloon, and it had a large beer garden. And I thought this building is just very interesting. You can see how high these windows are up here. And typical of the time before you had the car and, in public transportation, a lot of people would just walk to where they were going, and they would walk to work, but they lived very close to where they were working. And in this situation, you couldn't get much closer. He actually lived, I think, on one of these 2 floors, and with his wife and his 1-year-old child, and worked next door for 4 years. So he owned Tivoli Hall from 1978 to 82. And then in 82, he had an opportunity. He had an opportunity with this Bavarian brewery that was in Covington, Kentucky, that was established in 1866 by Julius DeGlow. It had some difficulties being successful. So it was founded in, right after the Civil War. And what happened is they had several owners. The brewery, after about 10 years, actually went into bankruptcy. In 77, there was a fellow by the name of John Meyer that got involved in the brewery after it was emerging from bankruptcy. And he decided to have a partnership with the brewmaster, Charles Roux, in 1880. And unfortunately, Charles, he had a fatality. He had a carriage accident. And John Meyer needed another partner. So he actually bought the interest from Charles DeGlow from his, from I guess a widow, maybe of Julius DeGlow, with William Riedlin. And actually it was a couple years after they had a partnership. So anyway, there was a partnership that was created, Meyer and Riedlin. They had a celebrated beer, but you can see down at the bottom of the sign, it says Bavarian Brewery. So often, sometimes you'd have a brewery name, and then you'd have the names of the proprietors. So in this situation, the brewery was Bavarian. It had been operating and known by that name since about 1870. But there were different proprietors. And beginning in 82, 83, proprietors were Meyer and Riedlin. This is a group of Meyer and Riedlin in 1884. And then here you have from the Williams Directory a listing of the Bavarian Brewery that indicates the proprietors. And at the time, it wasn't just a brewer of lager beer. As Jason had mentioned, lager beer was very popular among Germans. It was a lighter beer than an ale, but a challenge with the lager, it was more difficult to brew. It would take weeks, rather an ale could just take a couple of days, but it would take over a week or two and sometimes longer to ferment the lager beer. And the reason being is because I believe it was a bottom fermentation with the yeast. And so as opposed to an ale, it's a top fermenting, it takes less time. Also, in order to ferment, it has to be cool. And so you needed to have these caves in order to ferment the beer and then to store it so it wouldn't spoil. And so that's why if you've taken a tour of like the over the Rhine area, you'll see these cellars that are deep and kind of cool. And, you know, before refrigeration came around in around 1870, 1880, that's how they had to make a lager beer. They had to make it and store it in these cellars. So it was a very, very labor-intensive process. You can see here, if maybe some of you, if you're related to some of these ancestors or if you're from the Covington area, but this is actually a list of the people identified who they are here. And my great-grandfather is here. His son, William Jr., is on his lap. Next to him is the brewmaster, who is Anton or Tony Rue. And this is Ferdinand Rue, the father, I believe, of Tony. And over here you have, above the other sign, you have J.H. Cruzy, who was the secretary and treasurer. So these were kind of the main men of the Meyer and Riedlin proprietorship in the founding of what became Bavarian Brewing Company. This relationship between my grandfather and the Rue family might have been very strong. And sometimes you have these things maybe that your ancestors have passed on and you're not sure. But here you can see it says F. Rue, which is Ferdinand Rue, which is Tony's father. And interestingly, my grandfather had two sons and their middle names were both Ferdinand. So, you know, after you see and think about this for a while, like, was their relationship so strong that maybe William named his the middle names of his sons after Ferdinand Rue, the son of Tony, and possibly William may have known of Rue when he was in the over the Rhine area, or maybe actually Rue is also from Baden. It's possible that the Rue and Riedlin families, maybe they knew each other from Baden, or they knew of, you know, he had common friends. So sometimes these relationships you'll never really know for sure, but you can speculate and make some hypotheses and different scenarios on what may have happened. This is a group after the Bavarian Brewery Company became incorporated in Kentucky in 1889, about 10 years later. This is a group of the workers, and as you can tell, it's a bigger group than in that earlier picture. So here we have William Riedlin. Next to him is Tony. And we have William Riedlin Jr., a lot older than you saw earlier. And there was also Glyer family. They had at least 4 or 5 different family members that worked for the brewery, and some in different generations. So this was one, I believe, W.H. maybe Dick Glyer that's over here. And you had Fred Hoffman, this gentleman here that was a bookkeeper and very good friends with William Riedlin Jr. Here you have the officers. What's sad about this particular picture is that this Fred Hoffman that you see here, a year later, at only 22 years old, he was at the Riedlin farm for a celebration, I believe, a bachelor party. And he was swimming in the Licking River, and he died, he drowned. So, and this was kind of like, this was in in 1900 is that he passed away. This is an interesting picture, I thought, of the brewery, and this was taken from West Pike Street. So if you know where Glier's Getta is, this building here that says Wing Company kind of department, this wing is actually part of brewing. So it was Bavarian Brewing Company, and then the rest of the sign said bottling department. So this was the bottle department. You look close, you can see where it says ale and porter. So besides lager beer, they also brewed ale and porter. This was the original brewing building over here on the right. The mill house was behind it. And then they built a brew house that was behind them. And so this was all kind of built in the late 1880s. And here is a picture, a lithograph of what the layout looked like. So where Glier's is, this E is where Glier's is today. Here you have what was the original brewery. And of course, these buildings are basically, they're gone today. These buildings no longer remain. But this was the way it looked around 1900. And you can see here, there's a little legend here of what these particular buildings are. The next slide was a little later, 1902. You have this interesting, I think, sign of the Bavarian beer. It was actually made with glue chips, so it was a painted sign of glass on the back. I think it had maybe a titanium frame. Fortunately, we don't have the sign. If anybody knows anything about it, we'd love to maybe take better pictures of it or maybe see if we could acquire it. Also, we have a stein down here that actually has been in the family. So I do have the stein. It was from 1982 that's still been in our family. You'll see the star here, and the star was actually indicated that the beer was made according to German purity standards. And those standards were established back in 1400s by monks. And so these standards in brewing beer were adopted by most of the American, of course, the German brewers. In that picture that you saw, this is a picture of the stein. And so maybe another question maybe in the chat is, where's the stein from? Who made the stein? So we could maybe answer this at the end. This is a picture of the stein that we got from some of the photographs from the relatives. And when William Riedlin was president of the brewery, he was also president of a Kentucky Brewers Association. And by being in that association, being president, they awarded him this loving cup. This may have been in the tap room of the Bavarian Brewery, and it actually is a very, very early Rookwood mug. It was made, I believe, in about 1880, 1881, about the first year that Rookwood was in, that existed. So besides making items that were very fancy and that people would buy for special occasions, Rookwood also made commercial products, and this was actually made for Cincinnati Cooperage. Here's a picture of the brewery later on, about 10 years later. You can see what happened is Bavarian Brewery went through an expansive building program. So these earlier pictures of the brew house, this is what remains, but they built a big cooling tower. Refrigeration was very important. Instead of depending on ice like in the past, they could make their own ice. Ice was a big item for actually most brewers to sell. And so Bavarian actually sold ice as well. This building 9 is actually a part of the Kenton County Government Center today. So this building still exists. It was built in 1911. This building 7 here was built in about 1908. And this is the Glears building. So it was built at that time and it's being operated by Glears. These buildings over here, 3 and 10, were the stock houses. They had some structural issues, and unfortunately, these had to be demolished when they built the Kenton County Government Center. As far as the family of the Riedlin, they had 7 children. Unfortunately, 3 died, and so 4 really survived into adulthood. This is a picture of one of their daughters when she was only about 6 or 7 years old. Her name was Emma. And Emma is with her little sister, Mamie. And so she was my aunt. Unfortunately, Emma, when she became about 16, she caught typhoid and she passed away at the young age of 16. The family were really, obviously, it was a tragic event for them. And in memory of Emma, they created a stained glass that was installed in their home. And this is a picture of that stained glass. These are a couple pictures of a home that actually has been used for about the last century as a funeral home. And some of you may know it. It's the Middendorf Bullock Funeral Home that's over on Main Street. I think its address is 917. One time I think it may have been 925. This is a picture of the home that actually I received from some collections from my grandmother. And this was taken around maybe 1910. And on the back of the postcard or this photo, my grandmother indicated that they moved into this home around 1899 when she was around 10 years old. This is a picture of my grandmother. And I think what's interesting of the photos at that time is that the studios had advertisements on the back. And as you can see, sometimes they were very graphic. You know, they were illustrated very interesting. And so this is actually a note from my grandmother indicating her date when she was born. This is her a little older when she was 3 years old. This is a picture of my great-grandfather, William Riedlin Sr. This is William Riedlin Jr., the taller man, and the younger boy is Walter Riedlin. And in just a few years, you'll see in another photograph, Walter really kind of grew. This is a picture a little older of my grandmother and her sister. So this is Lucy and Mamie. And you can see, whoops, sorry, go back here a little bit. This is Walter. He attended a military institute in the Cincinnati area in College Hill called the Ohio Military Institute. And so he started attending that school, I believe, in around 1900 when he was maybe about 14. Attended it, I believe, for about 4 or 5 years. Here's a picture of the Riedlin daughters and their mother. And kind of unique to a lot of brewers, but before the car came and automated vehicles, they had to do deliveries with horses, horse-drawn wagons. So a lot of the brewers had farms in order to basically raise horses, to rest their horses. Sometimes they had farms also for crops, not only for their horses, but also maybe sometimes for hops, and that were used for malt for the brewing process. So this particular farm that the Riedlin had was on the Licking River. This is the Licking River, I believe, behind it, and it was near DeCourcy. And this is actually the river where that gentleman, Fred Hoffman, that I mentioned, is where he drowned actually about 10 years earlier, sadly. Now, this is an association, so the farm was used not only for like the horses, but it was for outings. It was not only for like this Bavarian Benevolent Association in 1910, but it was also for brewery picnics. And so the whole brewery, their family, their children, you can see a lot of children down here, they would all go to the farm and they have a nice outing. So the brewery actually created like a second family for most of the people that worked at the brewery. This is another picture at the farm. This is a picture of the picnic. And this was obtained from the Glyers. You can see that they've identified a lot of their family members in here. And I had a better copy that I've actually blown up. And you can see, it's kind of hard, but right here where this little cursor is, this is a blow up of Walter Jr. Even though he didn't have any children, for some reason, he's with a lot of children right there, as you can see. This is my Aunt Mamie. And this was Walter and his wife, Rose. And these are blown up from this photograph. This is the only picture that we were able to find that have both the Riedlin and Schott families. My grandfather is number 6 over here. His brother, Uncle Lou, is over here. William Riedlin Jr. is 7. My grandmother is 3. My great-grandmother on my grandfather's side is here 4. William Riedlin is 1. And it's interesting here, I think there's a lot of women in this picture. And if you look a little in the background, you'll see a lot of men. So obviously, I guess the women decided to come down here, and my ancestors decided to join the women and be in a picture with them, while most of the other men were left probably drinking beer up at the top. This is a picture of my grandmother and grandfather on their wedding day. They took a honeymoon in Havana, and this is actually a little indication of, I guess, like a remembrance my grandmother kept on their trip to Havana on the cruise line that they were on. This is a picture of the Ratskeller, and the reason this is in here, a couple reasons, but one is this is where actually the couple had their wedding reception. So it was in the Bavarian Ratskeller. This Ratskeller, I'm not sure exactly where it was located, in what building that you saw earlier, but it was used for a lot of civic activities, a lot of meetings of Bavarian associations. This was and having that part of the brewery, and of course, having beer served here. So this was an integral part of the Bavarian Brewery. Marriages and deaths. Unfortunately, what was kind of sad in going through the ancestry is that a lot of the Riedlins died fairly early in their age. You can see here that William Riedlin Jr., his wife died at only 26 years in 1909. There was, of course, Emma, the wife of William Riedlin. She died at only 52 years in 1912. Walter Riedlin, only 27 years. The youngest son of Walter or William Riedlin, he died in 1915. And then as Prohibition was approaching, William Riedlin Jr. and Sr. both died in 1919, within just 2 or 3 weeks apart. So it's very sad the way these deaths occurred, but there were some marriages and descendants, of which I'm one. This is a grave site out at the Highland Cemetery in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. Before they, Riedlins actually put their kind of more headstones here. This was actually, I think it was 1909, and because of the date, it would appear that this was probably when William Riedlin Jr.'s wife died in 1909. So that's what this picture is of. This is a picture of William Riedlin's 2 daughters with their children. This was actually my uncle on the right, who became president of the brewery. Coming to an end now, in remembrance of William Riedlin and finding a little bit more about the history, what was interesting is the Knights of Columbus have something that's in the Behringer-Crawford Museum that just really describes the history of William Riedlin Sr. That's in this document right here. And then also in the Bavarian Tap Room, they had this picture of William Riedlin that they attributed to as the founder of the brewery. So if there's any questions.
Okay, that was so interesting, Reed. I really didn't want you to stop, even though you did a great job of staying on time. Wow, fascinating. And those pictures were absolutely stunning. I noticed someone made a comment about them in the chat. And I'm curious, you know, how did your family, do you think they just valued photographs, or do you have any additional insights just about that was a lot of really high quality photos. How were they maintained?
You know, there was an effort. I think Jason kind of saw this too, but my cousin had of course, nothing else but a Bavarian beer crate. So he had a lot of these photos that was in this beer crate. The hammer was in the crate. There was a lot of items that I guess really my grandparents had just stored away, and then my uncle had them, and then my cousin had them, and nobody really looked at them for decades. We had no idea until just really about 1 or 2 years ago. And in going through them, the quality of these photos that you see, they've actually been restored a lot by me with Photoshop. So, but the basic photos, a lot of them, resolution was very high. And so actually we had a scanner, and I scanned them some at like about 7 megabytes so I could get some higher resolutions. And all these images, by the way, are on a website that's called BavarianBrewery.org. So if anyone's interested in looking at a lot more photos and more history about the brewery, please go to BavarianBrewery.org.
That is wonderful. And we actually have a question that just came in. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure if you're not muted, let's go ahead and stay muted. But one question just came in, and someone asked if you, or if you know of any lists of Bavarian employees somewhere around the time of 1884 to 1910. They have a family member, a great uncle who was an employee. Any chance something like that might be on that website?
Yes, and actually we kind of went over it a little bit right here,
Yeah.
but is the slide up? Is it still?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Can you see it? So in 1884, this picture, and this is the name of the people that worked for Bavarian Brewery in 1884.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, we'll let that sit up for just a second. And
we have been compiling names on that website as well, adding people to it, right, Reed?
Yeah, I've actually spent quite a bit of time on this. We have over 200, I think about 250 names now. And besides the names of like these names that are included in the list, we also have names that came from a Bavarian Tap newsletter. So we've got about 75 names back in the 50s. And then also between 1938 and 1960, what was interesting is my uncle gave me all of the Bavarian Brewery Company minutes. And in those minutes, it had a lot of names because they paid a lot of bonuses to some of the key people in the brewery, and they had a list of all those names. So from different sources, we've really compiled what we call a tribute list of 250 people that have worked at the brewery between, well, actually for almost 100 years.
That's incredible. We have a couple of other questions, and I'm just scanning through here. Someone did make a comment and ask if your first name is a takeoff of Riedlin, and I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I'd like you to answer.
Your assumption was correct.
It's a wonderful way to honor your family.
It was interesting. I think a lot of families maybe have a similar type situation with people in their family, but my uncle, for instance, his name was William Riedlin Schott. And of course, my grandmother and Lucy Riedlin named him after her father, and after the Riedlin name. And interesting, one thing I didn't go into about Riedlin is that Riedlin in Germany, actually his name was spelled with an R and then U with an umlaut, D-L-I-N. So the German spelling of Riedlin, and it was probably pronounced more like Rudlin rather than Riedlin. But when they came over, when they got on the boat to come over to America, I guess in the passenger list, they had it was an American boat, probably an American guy that asked what their names were. And he did the best he could in spelling the name. And I guess he couldn't figure out what to do with the U with the umlaut other than make it an I-E. So when they came into this country, like a lot of immigrants, their names changed.
Sure. One of the questions that came actually has to do with that comment, which is, have you tried or have you maybe had any success tracing your genealogy even further back in Germany prior to the ancestors coming here?
I have, especially on the Schott side. So the Schotts were from an area called Franconia, which is in northern Bavaria. And up until the Napoleonic Wars, Franconia was actually its own country. My uncle and my grandfather were both a little perplexed where the Schotts were from. And so that was kind of a quest that I had a few years ago, is to see if I could solve that. And on the Riedlin side, I know that, what area they're from, and eventually I would like to actually travel to what was Baden and maybe go by their homes. But what was interesting is I was able to actually do that for the Schott family. And we were able to find the village that they were from. It was near a little town called Coburg, about 50 miles north of Nuremberg. And so we actually visited that area 2 years ago. And it was amazing to be not only in the same village, but also most of those villages, there was a church that basically was kind of the center for most of these villages. And to being able to go into that church and know where your ancestors practiced their religion. And then what was interesting with the Schott family is they had some epitaphs of Schotts that had served in the wars that were in the church. And some of these epitaphs included the names of some of my ancestors. And to see that was really, it was, you feel much more of a connection. You have a better understanding and a better appreciation for what your ancestry had to go through.
Wow, absolutely. Changing gears for just a second, I have two pretty different questions. One question came in, and it's a sad topic, but you mentioned the father and son who died within a very short time of each other, and I'm pretty sure you mentioned that was in 1919. And yes. I was wondering, was that to do with the Spanish flu by any chance?
Apparently, it definitely was. It seems with the younger Riedlin, with William Jr. So he was only 37 years old, and the Spanish flu actually had like 3 bouts in America. It started really in 1918, and then actually in the spring of 1919 was kind of its 3rd wave. And unfortunately, that 3rd wave looks like it brought him down. And I'm not sure about his father. I don't think the Spanish flu maybe was as bad for older people at that time. And his father had asthma, severe case, and he actually died in Asheville, North Carolina, at a health resort. So they had these warm water springs down in Asheville, North Carolina. And it was, I think, kind of a tradition for the Riedlin family to occasionally go down there. And sadly, another death, actually with his son Walter in 1915. Actually, Walter died in Asheville, North Carolina, like his father did, 4 years later.
Oh my goodness.
And so when you look at some of these and look at the dates and the coincidences, it's just, it's sad.
It is. Very, very, very much so. On a little bit of a different note, Miss Karen, we'll say Ginn, sorry, Karen, if I mispronounced your last name. She was wondering if you know anything about the man who was the brewmaster during the 1930s. That's a little later than we went in this presentation. We kind of stopped in a little earlier than that, but I didn't knew anything.
I'm sorry. All that information is actually on the website, and it's done by periods, time periods. So she can go into the time period for the 30s. Actually, it'd be kind of the Prohibition time, and then just right after Prohibition. There was, I believe, a Fred Faller was the first brewmaster after Prohibition. And there was a group comprised of actually Riedlin's granddaughter and her husband, named Murray Voorhees, that basically bought the brewery, I think, from the Riedlin heirs, or probably from my grandmother, back in around 1932. And then they started it up, and all this is explained on the website for this time period. But unfortunately, they weren't well capitalized. And also there was the Great Flood of 1937 that some of the people might remember that did a lot of damage. And it actually, even though the brewery was a mile up from the river, it actually sustained some damage during 1937. So the combination of being undercapitalized and the flood made the brewery in 1937 go into receivership and bankruptcy. And after bankruptcy, I think my grandmother didn't want the brewery to really be owned by someone else, wanted to stay in the family. And so my grandfather, her husband, and 3 of his brothers bought the brewery out of bankruptcy in 1937 and then incorporated it the following month in 1938.
Wow.
And so in 38, I think there was a Gruner, there was an Albert Gruner and Walter Gruner. So when the Schatts became really owners and operators of the breweries, there were 2 Gruners that were brewmasters at that time.
Well, I didn't know about the website, so I'm really looking forward to learning more and going there myself. And we just had someone post the website for everyone else to see in the chat. Great. So if you're watching, you can go to the chat and get that website and check it out for yourself. I think we could have done this for another hour. I can't believe that we're already at pretty much our conclusion. One of the things that I wanted to let everyone know is that we had talked about, because there is so much rich history here, potentially we have actually history hours planned out now through the end of August. But we had talked about the potential of maybe having this on as a topic again. So watch the Behringer-Crawford Facebook page, and we're thinking about putting up a survey about, what people might want to hear about coming up in September. So give us your thoughts, all of you listeners and watchers out there, and let us know what you'd like to hear more about.
If I may add one more thing, is
yes,
that if people haven't had a chance to go to the Kenton County Government Center, there's a very nice brewery exhibit at the county center. It's right off of the main lobby. And also what we'll be having there, and Jason's going to be working on this in the next month or 2, we have 2 display cases upstairs that'll be populated with various Breweriana items from the brewery. And also that mystery question. I don't know if we've gotten into that yet.
Yes, we haven't gotten any answers. We need you to tell us who, actually we have one guess. So can you please tell us who made the stein, and then we'll have Jason say what that other item was.
Okay, on the stein, it was actually made by a German company called Metlock. And it was made in the maybe 80s or 90s. And it's a company that became Villeroy and Bach. And so I think they're still in existence. They make china today, but they had a special process in making steins that had like little edges or reliefs in them. And this particular stein was about 5 liters. It's a big stein. And it was actually like in that photo, and then it was also in a little brochure that Jason's has and scanned for me, and actually that's online too. It's on the website, so you can actually download this. When Riedlin was, he was a city alderman, and he in this book about this political group that he was with, they actually called the stein just simply the stein.
It really stands on its own, I think, as being the stein. It's absolutely gorgeous. Do we have a second? Jason, can you tell us what our mystery item is? As far as I can tell, I do not believe anyone guessed. I'm going to go through the chat really quickly and see.
Okay.
But why don't you go ahead and talk about it?
So our mystery item is...
You have a guess. I think we do have the right thing by somebody. Go ahead.
Doing. So this is actually, it's a Heidelberg brewery, which was in Covington. And this is actually a tire cover so that they could advertise their student Prince beer. Probably, if I had to guess, it would actually be used on delivery vehicles.
Yep.
Well, our winners of today's quiz are Jim and Martha Johnson. So you will be receiving a Northern Kentucky History Hour pin in the near future. And those of you who have been watching in the past and have not yet gotten your pins, I do need to buy some stamps, but then those will be coming out to you in the near future. So we are at 7:29. So I want to say, Mr. Schott, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. Jason,
thank you for letting me join you.
Thank you so much. And to Jason, if you all have not watched Jason's Curator chats, they're available from on YouTube, and I believe from our Facebook page as well. Always very interesting and very accessible. So definitely check those out. We appreciate your support, all of you members out there. And if you're considering being a member, you can go to bcmuseum.org. Until next week, take care. Thank you.